Gary, I keep meaning to write you. I worked with the New Hampshire College and University Council, and the announcement of those dates went out to all of the colleges.
Oh, wow. Great.
We'll see if anybody participates.
Oh, yeah.
I asked for a reminder, but people were complaining that students aren't as active right now. So.
Yeah, there's only about three registrants for the focus group so far, but there's another. I also had another reminder go out today.
Okay.
So we'll see.
Did you have any luck with the taxpayer group I sent you to?
They said they're pretty busy right now, just trying to stay in their own local businesses, so they wouldn't participate this time. They're focusing on the businesses they were running and the two contacts. I don't know about the taxpayer group in general, but so I mean, it was a response that made sense based on what everyone's going through right now.
I guess.
Hey, Chris, Jane.
Good afternoon.
Susan, your desk is too neat. Isn't there something about neat desk, sick mind, something like that?
Yes, and this is not my typical desk, right? I am typically not neat, but you know, I'm only coming into the office a couple of days a week. So you have to see my home desk, which I am not showing you.
Okay.
There's the Zoom desk and then there's the real desk.
That's absolutely true.
For those of you that are on, there have been a couple of little revisions in the agenda for today. I sent you a revised agenda via email with an attachment about 45 minutes ago or so. So just make sure you've got that. Jordan, is that possible to post the revised version someplace accessible to our attendees?
It's already up on the website, so we're good.
Of course.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. So I think we're still waiting for a few more people. I see Senator Khan is getting signed in, still waiting on John. Rick Ladd, maybe. Dave Ryan, Beardmore. Mary Heath. I didn't get any notifications that anybody'd be out today, so.
No, I know, Jane, I think you have to step out a little bit early, I believe.
Okay.
Yep. And there's Mary.
There's Mary.
Bill.
Down by the riverside today.
On the banks of the Pemmy. So I think we're still waiting on maybe John Beardmore, Dave Ryan. I thought I saw, oh, there's Bill, Jay Kahn, and Rick Ladd. There's Beardmore.
Hello.
Hey, Bill. So we're waiting on John, Dave. I think that's it. Is that right?
What happened to Jay? Jay was here.
Jay was here. He just stepped away.
Yeah, right. And John Morgan.
And John Morgan. So we're waiting on Morgan, Ryan. Yeah, and Ladd. Why don't we probably get things started while we're waiting for them. Does that sound like a good idea? We're 2 minutes in, so good. Why don't we fire things up? We'll call to order this meeting of the Commission to Study School Funding. Today's October 5th, 2020, a little after 2 o'clock. And per the compliance with the governor's emergency order, we'll begin by taking attendance via roll call. And I'll start it off. Dave Luno here in Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund. Mel?
Mel Myler calling in from Contucook, New Hampshire.
Thanks, Mel. Dick Ames?
Yes, I'm here in Jaffrey in my office alone.
Great. Rick Ladd? Oh, he's muted, but we know he's here.
Yeah, I'm here alone in Haverhill.
Great. Thanks, Rick. And John Morgan's online?
I'm here in Exeter, New Hampshire, and all three of my kids are present.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. And Bill Ardinger?
I'm here in Concord, New Hampshire at my law firm office alone.
Great. Thanks. And Jay Kahn?
Present in Keene and by myself.
Great. Thanks, Jay. And Jane Bergeron?
Good afternoon, Jane Bergeron, home alone with my black lab Otis here in Litchfield.
Awesome. Thanks, Jane. And Corrine Cascadden?
Here, home in Berlin, New Hampshire.
Great. Thanks, Corrine. I don't know if Dave Ryan's on yet. I don't see him. John Beardmore?
Good afternoon, John Beardmore, alone in Hopkinton.
Thanks, John. And Iris Esterbrook?
Hi, I'm in Barrington. Husband's somewhere around.
Thanks, Iris. And Barbara Tremblay?
Hi, all. Barbara Tremblay and Keene. Husband is in the other room.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And Chris Dwyer?
Chris Dwyer, alone in my Portsmouth office.
Thank you, Chris. And Susan Heward?
Hi there, Susan Heward, alone in my office in Concord.
Doug, thanks, Susan. And Val Zanchuk?
Val Zanchuk is alone in his office in Jaffrey.
Great, thanks, Val. And Mary Heath?
Mary Heath is here in Manchester. My husband's here. He just had a hip replacement, so he can't go too far today.
Okay. Thanks, Mary. I hope all's well there. So super. And we've got our team from the Carsey School, and I'll start it off with Carrie Portree.
Carrie Portree in my apartment in New Hampshire, or in Dover. My husband's in the other room.
Great, thanks, Carrie. And Jordan Hensley?
Jordan Hensley, also in Dover. My fiance is in the other room.
Okay. And Bruce Mallory?
Here, home alone in my office in Kittery Point, Maine.
Great. And we've got a guest, well, a familiar guest, Drew Atchison from AIR.
Hey, Drew Atchison here in Washington, D.C. Glad to be back.
Great. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Drew. Hey, just a quick comment. I do get mailings from the Carsey School on regular updates. And I think in this, I'm not sure if they're monthly or every couple of weeks or something like that, but prominently highlighted is the work the Carsey School is doing with the School Funding Commission, as well as a number of other reports and projects that the Carsey School is working on. And I think it's sort of fun to read through them because you recognize how we've basically got the line of, I mean, definitely the top of the order, top of the batting order as far as, you know, our team from Carsey. And believe it or not, this isn't the only thing they're working on. So, so again, my thanks go out to this extraordinary team to help us through this.
Thank you, Dave.
So, let's see, Jordan, how are we looking as far as access?
I think we're good. We've got 17 members of the public on the line with us today, and no one's reporting any issues.
Okay, fantastic. I'm glad we got a good turnout, and thanks to everybody for being able to hang with us today. And before we get into approval of minutes, just like to sort of review what you know, what we hear every week, but it's just a good course, I think, to review it on our group agreements that continue to work very well for us.
I'll make a quick comment. I'm not going to share the screen, but we're all familiar with them by now. The purpose of these agreements is to be sure that we listen carefully to each other. If we disagree, focus on the issue, not the person. Consider asking a question if you disagree rather than trying to prove your point. As I say, share your time, make sure everybody gets a chance to participate, and we all share responsibility for making it a constructive conversation.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And I'd also like to welcome Jen Ford. I just noticed Jen joined the meeting, so thanks for joining us this afternoon. Let's see, shortly after our meeting a couple of weeks ago, I believe meeting minutes were circulated. If not, they're definitely on the website and the folder for today's meeting. I just wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to give them a quick look-see. They are very, very thorough. And so with that, I would take a motion to approve the minutes of the commission meeting dated September 21st, 2020.
So moved.
Motion has been moved and seconded. Are there any comments or questions or deletions or amplifications or any changes anybody would suggest to make? So Jordan, thanks very much for assembling these. With that, I think we can go through a quick roll call to approve the minutes of September 21st. So I'll start it out. Luno, yes. Myler.
Yes.
Ames.
Yes.
Ladd.
Yes.
Khan.
Yes.
Morgan.
Yes.
Ardinger.
Yes.
Bergeron.
Yes.
Cascadden.
Yes.
Dave Ryan with us. Don't see him. Beardmore.
Yep.
Estabrook.
Yes.
Tremblay.
Yes.
Dwyer.
Yes.
Heward.
Yes.
Zanchuk.
Yes.
Heath.
Yes.
Terrific. So the minutes are approved. Moving some screens around. And as Bruce noted, just as we were getting started, we do have an updated agenda for today. Unfortunately, Senator Guide is not able to join us this afternoon, and our regards go out to him. But he expressed interest to join us at a later date that's convenient. So this is specifically with respect to part of the statutory language that established the commission that requests that the commission look into Class A, B, C properties and looking at potential impact on tax rates for those properties. We have heard, I think, over the last few months, some related testimony from from the Department of Revenue Administration on property classifications and the fact that we basically have two tax rates, one for utility and one for non-utility property. So changes to that would certainly, make that more of a significantly involved process. But we can hear more about that when Senator Gaeta becomes available for that, rather than getting into a detailed discussion on that today. Everybody all right with that? Okay. So with that, I think we want to use the time to bring in Drew to take us through the version 8 update of the simulator that I think addresses a couple of particular issues that were raised by the commission. One is the sort of the cliff effect that we were seeing with the school size weights, and the other was addressing what the contributions and tax rates, I guess, would in cities and towns that are members of cooperative school districts. So with that, I'll hand it over to Bruce and Drew to talk us through that. And there was also some documentation that came over with this simulator and a discussion on the school size weighting. So we can talk a little bit about that. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
I'll just pass it on to Drew. He can sort of make sure everybody's working from the same page. This came to us last week. Thanks, Drew, and your colleagues for being so responsive to the now really specific questions that are coming up as we go deeper and deeper into this. But Drew will just orient us for a few minutes and then basically be available to answer questions and be part of whatever follow-up discussion there might be about these particular factors that several commission members had questions about. Well, Drew, to you.
All right, sounds good. So I can either share my screen or just kind of talk about what changes were made. So let me know what works best.
I think let's sort of talk about it, and if somebody wants to sort of see it in action, we can pop it up there. But it's as I think Corrine was saying, it's a lot of data, and maybe hard to pick up on a shared screen.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll just walk through kind of the major changes. I'll start with the simulator, and then we can talk about the cliff effect memo as well. But in terms of the simulator, there's a few new sheets that I added. The first is a sheet that shows the calculations of a smooth enrollment weight. And I guess to go over these calculations, it might make sense to talk about the memo as well. But our approach to smoothing out the cliffs was to construct slopes that connect each of the categorical weights. So rather than setting a flat categorical weight for the entire enrollment category, there are now slopes that connect each enrollment category, so that as you move from more higher to lower enrollments, the weights increase continuously. So there's no longer jumps between the categories. The different categories kind of connect at the ends of each category. So what that means is that rather than having 4 discrete enrollment weights or district size category weights, there's going to be a different weight for each district depending on the exact enrollment in the district. So that means it's a little more complicated in terms of calculating the weight. And because the simulator is at the town level, what we did was calculate the enrollment weight for each district and then tag each town to the districts that the town sends their students to. And then for any district that sends their kids to more than one district, we calculated a weighted average of the enrollment weights to apply to the town. So the weights apply to districts, but because the funding goes to towns in the simulator, we had to kind of track the districts to the towns. So on the smooth enrollment weight page, you'll see how we calculated the enrollment weight for each town in New Hampshire. So then in the town cost simulator, we apply those smooth, what we call the smooth enrollment weights. So you'll see a new cell, C3, a new toggle where you can choose to apply the smooth recommended weights. And if you set that to yes, it will apply the weights that are calculated in the sheet that I just talked about, the smooth enrollment weight sheet. If you select no, then it will apply the categorical enrollment weights that are in rows 16 through 19 in the little weights box below. So if you select yes, apply the smooth recommended enrollment weights, the smooth enrollment weights are going to trump, or well, perhaps I shouldn't use that word, are going to supersede any of the weights that are in those cells there. So if you apply the smooth enrollment weights, those will override the weights that are in those boxes there. And then the other change that was made to the simulator that was brought to my attention by Dick Ames, and perhaps he can say a few words to this as well, is the cooperative district calculations. So the worksheet next to the town cost simulator shows some calculations for cooperative districts. And so the idea here is that these towns that are a part of cooperative district, they pool their revenue and so they're not necessarily going to act as if they're individual towns. So if they're part of a cooperative district, they're going to act as part of that cooperative district if the entire amount of funding that they receive across all the towns is more or less than the total amount of funding that they've received previously. They'll act in accordance to adjust their total revenues to meet the needs of the district rather than act as individual towns. So in that sheet, you'll see that I've followed the template that Dick sent me, where I list the towns under each cooperative district. I summed the enrollment, summed the funding, calculated a per pupil based on the total enrollment and funding, and then calculated the total actual revenue that the towns in those cooperative districts received, and then calculated an adjusted tax rate or a revised tax rate that would get them back to their actual levels of revenue based on the entire funding of the cooperative district rather than each individual town. So it's a slightly different way of calculating it. I think in general, it's consistent with everything that's been presented previously, but it's just recognizing the fact that the towns in cooperative districts are going to behave a little bit differently and are going to behave collectively rather than as individual towns when they're making decisions about whether or not to raise additional revenue. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions, or see if Dick wants to talk any more about the cooperative district issue that he brought to my attention.
Well, I'll say a few words only. And first, thank you, Drew, for doing this tedious task. Well, a lot of this is tedious, I'm sure, but you're a lot more skilled at it than probably any of us. And so thank you for doing that. I think the main import of this spreadsheet, the cooperative district spreadsheet, is in relationship to the question of additional taxes to go above the simulated formula amount. And there, it would happen at the district level. The district would choose to carry on, let's say, at the higher budget number that it's been at, rather than go down to the formula amount, the collective formula amount for all the towns. And at that juncture, the question is, well, if the cooperative goes up or stays at that higher level, how are those funds allocated? And what Drew has done is sort of reconfigured and looked at the situation where the cooperative budget as a whole has subtracted out from it the essentially mandated state funding that the new formula arrangement would provide, as well as federal money and I guess special ed money. And then that addition beyond what the simulated cost amounts provide is apportioned to the towns, and then taxes follow, additional taxes follow, and you get very different values from what had been arrived at before. I think much more consistent with the reality of what an additional amount in the budget signifies. So I think it's a good step forward. My question is how do we include this calculation in our understanding of what's happening? I'm not sure I see it in the simulator itself, in the town cost simulator. So that's my question.
So if you change the values in the main town cost simulator worksheet, the values in the cooperative district calculations will change as well now. So the cooperative district calculations sheet is linked to the town cost simulator. So I think it's just a matter of recognizing when you're looking through the simulator, understanding which towns are part of cooperative districts and which towns are not. So if you're going to look at a town that's and also which elements you're interested in. So as Dick mentioned, it really mostly affects the additional revenue to get back to their actual current levels of revenue, or the current levels of revenue as of FY20. So if you're interested in kind of how the funding formula works to get to their simulated funding amount, then you would look at the town cost simulator. If you're interested in more of the revenue side, then you'd have to make a decision of whether to look at the town cost simulator sheet or the cooperative district calculations. And as Dick mentioned, if you're looking at a town in a cooperative district, then it's probably more accurate, or is more accurate, to look at the cooperative district calculations on the revenue side rather than the town cost simulator itself.
Fine.
Okay, thanks, Drew. Thanks, Dick, for explaining that. So it doesn't change how what the simulated or what the estimated cost model is for those towns. All it does is adjust it shows what the additional contribution would be to bring them to actual.
Yes, that's right. So
that's my understanding too. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
David?
Questions? Yeah, Jay.
Well, just to, it works. I'm just going to reiterate something that Drew was saying just now. It does roll from the distribution of a cooperative district. It does roll then to the town simulator. I've got a couple of cooperative districts in my Senate district. So I was looking to see if the totals did roll through. They do, and it establishes a proportionality for each of the towns within that cooperative district. So just as Drew was saying, you can, the funds raised from different sources may be altered in the total amounts, but the proportionality at least is maintained into the town simulator.
Jay, just for your information, from my little house district, I have 3 cooperative districts that reach into my 4-town district.
Yeah, you don't have such a little district.
So other questions on the, there must be some more questions on the co-op part, and then I want to sort of back into some questions on the enrollment rates. Co-op simulator questions? I'm not seeing hands on that, so. All right, Drew, I've got a question on the enrollment weights. So I guess I'm not sure I understand what you did. You said they're sort of different. They're customized now for every town.
Yeah. It might make sense at this point for me to share my screen so I can go through one of the figures in the memo. So let me see if I can.
Yeah, you should be able to do that.
Do that.
Oh, wait a minute. Do I need to do that?
I think I can do it. Yep. Let me zoom in here. Yeah, so this is the original way that the weights were calculated. If a district was under 200, they would get a weight of 1.08. If it was 201 to 600, they would get the weight of 0.57, etc. So it was very easy to identify whether districts were within these categories. If they were within a given category, they got the given weight. What we did was, rather than have these cliffs, and you can see the cliffs here very obviously, rather than have the cliffs, we connected each category by adding a slope to the line. So now each category connects continuously to the next category. There are no cliffs. There are kind of kinks in the slope, but there are no drop-offs. So what that means is that the weights change even within a category. So if you're within the negative, or if you're within the less than 200 category, the weights range from 1.6 to about 0.7. So depending on your exact enrollment, if you're have an enrollment of 1 student, you're going to be at the 1.6 range. If you have an enrollment of 199 students or 200 students, you're going to be at the 0.7 point. So you have to, rather than just say, are you in the category, yes or no, apply the weight, you have to say, it's kind of a 2-step process. Are you within the less than 200 category? If yes, you would have to apply this formula to calculate the weight for the specific enrollment within that category. So if you remember your algebra class from way back when, y equals mx plus b, m is the slope. So here's the slope term, negative 0.00541. So for each additional student within this category, the weight is going to decrease by 0.541, and this 1.621 is your y-intercept term. So you apply this formula within that category to calculate the exact weight for the district.
So Drew, I'm I'm just trying to understand, particularly in the first one, which has the steepest slope, why we still don't have the same problem. I understand it's not a cliff problem per se, but for let's say in the first the first one's what, 1 to 200 students.
Yep.
So let's say I've got a district with, say it's a small district, it's got 100 students in it, and now I've got 5 more students that are considering to come in. I'm going to not just get less of a enrollment weight for those 5 students, but they're going to bring down the enrollment weight for the previous 100 students as well.
Yeah, that's right. The enrollment weight will fall, but it will fall by 5 times 0.004, or I guess so that would be 0.02. So your enrollment weight would fall by 0.02, rather than in the previous example, if you were at 200 and you went to 201, your enrollment weight would fall by 0.3 or something, or 0.5.
Yep.
So yeah, it still goes down, and it goes down as enrollment increases, but there are no jumps. So there are no huge discontinuities where there's going to be a huge cliff. So and that's the way enrollment weights are always it's going to cost more in small districts than it does in large districts because of economies of scale. So this way preserves the general mechanism of the enrollment weights, and preserves kind of the overall structure of the enrollment weights that we had in terms of their overall levels, but just kind of smooths them out.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so a district would not be worse off from an estimated cost model standpoint to go from 100 students to 105 students, even though their school size weighting goes down. They certainly get 5 more in the ADMA count, which is multiplied times the base plus all of the weighting factors. So
right.
Okay.
I've got a different question.
Yeah, go ahead, Dick.
This chart is a good one to talk about this aspect of it. When you go to these slopes, which I think is the right way to go, I believe that it carries with it additional costs, because that's essentially what happens when you go from steps to a slope. Your each increment related to size, if you're going in the right direction, costs you more. Whereas if you've got a flat line for a period of time, it doesn't until suddenly you hit that cliff and you go up. So I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Drew, but there's this carries with it a change in that's an upward change in the cost calculation overall. And I'm wondering if that's true, and how that is taken care of, or whether that's just added to the bottom line.
I don't think that's true. And the reason why it's not true is that each of these lines, I mean, you can imagine these lines being able to kind of pivot at a certain point, right? So the point at which we chose to pivot these lines is the average, weighted average enrollment within these categories. So if you pivot the line around the weighted average enrollment within each category, then some districts are winning and some districts, well, it's not winning, but some districts are getting more and some districts are getting less as you pivot that line. So if we go to the simulator, If we go to the town cost simulator here, and right now the smooth enrollment weights are set at no. The total proposed formula revenue is 2.915 billion. If we change this to yes, it actually goes down by 2 million to 2.913 million. But the intent was to keep the bottom line about the same, and apply and just smooth out the discontinuities.
Perfect. That makes sense to me.
Dave, I've got a question on the
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Drew, I was just wondering if you could point to the place on the co-op district calculation worksheet that kind of is a precedent for cells on the town cost simulator. I wasn't able to see that right away.
So the total formula, so if you're on the co-op district calculations worksheet,
yes, sir.
Most of the elements are just pulled in directly from the town cost simulator.
Correct.
So column C through L are pulled in directly from the town cost simulator. The only one that's really not pulled in directly from the town cost simulator is column N, which is the share of local education property tax revenues. And I added a little note to cell N1 that shows where that document came from. That's a document that Dick pointed me to that shows the distribution or the revenue sharing agreements for each town within a cooperative district. But everything else is pretty much just pulled directly from the town cost simulator worksheet. So as you update the town cost simulator worksheet, the co-op district calculations sheet updates accordingly.
So if you wanted, I was looking at, before this change, I was looking at the town cost simulator and trying to determine the aggregate amount of additional tax, additional local education tax to get everyone back to what they had been actually before the model applied. And you could get, like that was $340 million. Does that number change on the town cost simulator as a result of the co-op calculations, or do you kind of have to modify the town cost simulator assumption of how much more tax would be in that column of additional local tax to get back to actual by going to the co-op district calculation sheet and taking data from that sheet?
No, I think the total amount should be the same, because it's just the difference in revenue between the formula funding and actual revenue. So it's just aggregating. So when you go to the town cost worksheet, it's just aggregating those to the district level, to the cooperative district rather than the town, but the totals are still the same.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Rick, and then Corinne.
Thank you very much, Dave. For Drew. Drew, was there, in looking at going to the enrollment weights by district, that sheet you have, I've been looking at that. Did you, in your calculations, figure out the number of districts, for example, that have 200 or less students, the number that have 600 to 201, and in looking at that, did you look at like some kind of relationship between the district and maybe the equalized property value per pupil, or the achievement scores in that district? or the number of grade levels that that district has in their structure, if they're doing it locally or if they're having to tuition out. I'm just trying to find out what was the rationale in determining this figure of 200 or less. Why not 300 or less? And how many of those districts, as I said, are districts that are wealthy districts and have high achievers?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the district size categories are based on some work that Bruce Baker has done, in particular, looking at kind of efficiency of districts with respect to district size. And I mean, I think there are some established kind of cutoffs where districts below 2,000 students start to have inefficiencies. So I think that 2,000 cutoff is an important one. Beyond that, I think it's a little more, I guess, wishy-washy in terms of where you want to set those boundaries. But the way that we set the boundaries here results in fairly equal numbers of districts in each of the size categories. So within each of the size categories, there's anywhere from 20 to 30 districts, and that includes the over 2,000 category. And that's important from a cost modeling standpoint, because if you have any size categories where there's very few districts, then it's going to be hard to estimate a good estimate of cost within that size category. So it was a little bit out of convenience in terms of making sure that each of the size categories had sufficient numbers of districts to be able to estimate a cost estimate within that size category. So that's one part of your question. The second part is whether these small districts have high valuation or serve relatively low need students. I think our approach is to separate out the cost factors from the revenue side. So when we're talking about cost factors, we're talking about the factors that are going to increase costs within a district, and having a small district has increased costs. How the funding for that district works is a different question. If you look, and I think the way that we approach this in our kind of minimum local contribution is to say that if a district can fund their district through local revenues, through the minimum local contribution, then they don't need as much state revenues to support them. So I think that's kind of where you're going with this in terms of, is it fair to say that these low enrollment districts need more revenue if they're also high valuation districts and have relatively low needs otherwise. And I think that the cost is still the cost, but they are going to get less state revenue because they can support more of their own costs through their local revenue sources.
I asked that question simply because having lived prior to this in a state where we had many small school districts, the state finally enacted legislation that any school district that's less than 25 cannot exist. And so we used to have superintendents which were hiring teachers. The first question they asked, how many kids do you have? And bring them in, and then we can maintain our district. I just don't want, I understand the issues associated with very small districts, but I don't want to go the other way from where we're trying to go, and we're trying to go with more consolidation of districts.
I'd like to follow up on.
Well, hold on, because there were we have Kareen and then we also had Jay. But if Iris, if this is right on that string that that
Yeah.
tied in with what Rick's question is, if Corinne and Jay don't mind.
Okay, all right,
All
can wait.
No, go ahead, Iris. I try to keep
No,
up.
it's very much on the small schools way. I expressed my concern before that, you know, I understand Drew's point that how the funding works is a different question, but if you don't apply some measure of fiscal capacity to giving these small schools that much extra funding, then you're from the get-go tying this to the kind of funding scheme that's also outlined here. You know, are the two pieces definitely connected or aren't they? And can this stand alone if the funding doesn't go to direct targeting? And I have the concern that he has, because when I look at the results, I see that towns like Newcastle, Newington, and Waterville Valley are getting a lot per pupil in communities that I would consider wealthy. And I understand that the argument Drew makes is that it's not of much consequence overall because they don't have many students. So we're not giving away that much money. But nonetheless, I think that it would make a whole lot more sense to measure the fiscal capacity of these small school districts to see whether they're doing that by choice, and rather than creating in policy a weighting scheme that rewards that kind of governance. So I still have that concern, as Rick does.
Okay, thanks, Iris. Corinne?
Okay, thanks. That was an interesting conversation. I learned something from that. So I'm glad they talked about it, because I broke out the first simulated tool to look at 24 regional districts, and they range in enrollment from 17 to just under 1,200 students. Now that this other simulator tool is here, does it replace the first one or not? That's one question. And then if it doesn't, the differences from what I could tell is what the first simulator kind of identified a sample state tax and no local tax. And this second one adds the variable of a local education tax and a state tax if that were chosen. Can you speak to what are the difference between the two tools? And if I'm going to pull out 24 regional districts, should I use only the second tool that you just sent? Because you revised the weights for the enrollments.
So I think it's a matter, so if you stick with the original weights, then the calculation should be exactly the same. So if you set the use smooth recommended enrollment weights to no, then the simulator will give you the exact same values as the previous simulator. The difference is if you want to look specifically at the towns within those cooperative districts or regional districts, and you want to look at the revenues that they might want to raise above what the formula suggests, then you would want to look at the new simulator and look at the cooperative district calculation sheet. So I don't think anything has been taken away or changed from the old functionality of the simulator. There's just been a few kind of new tools added. So there's nothing wrong with the old simulator in terms of the town simulator worksheet. There's just some new things that are added to this one. And if you're interested in those new things, then I would encourage you to use the new simulator.
Okay, because I do see a difference. But that's helpful. Good. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Corinne. And while we're on this, and I know Jay's coming up, I've got a mechanical question also on the new simulator. But for any school district or any town where you've got a enrollment of students, if that ADMA changed and put it onto, you know, a different slope weighting, will that happen by town? So if you went from 195 students to 210 students, it would transition to the new slope?
Yeah, yeah, it will. So there's kind of a two-step process in the smooth enrollment weight worksheet. The first step is to identify which category of enrollment each district is in, whether that's the less than or equal to 200, the 200 to 600, et cetera. Once it identifies the category that it's in, then it applies the correct slope. Each category has a different slope.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks, Drew. Sorry about that, Jay.
Okay. My primary interest here was to make sure that this got discussed and that the commissioners who've had concerns about this got them out there, because I think there's still continue to be perverse aspects to this, and I think they've been discussed with one possible exception, and that's that you could see where declaring yourself an independent district and then having a cooperative agreement might even benefit. I mean, there's some, or there's something about becoming smaller that gives you an incentive to then, and then somebody could then charge back to that smaller district for their administrative support. I mean, that happens in our state. I don't want to confuse this any more than it's necessary. I think what I wanted to accept is that, Drew, I think you've done what we asked you to do. You've explained to us an alternative that smooths the weighting by actual enrollment as opposed to steps. And I think still for the commission is to determine if this is a variable that's going to be turned on or turned off.
Yeah, and I think when we did our study with Vermont, they had a similar concern, and what Vermont decided to do that wasn't part of AIR's process or our team's process, but just what they decided to do was to define necessarily small schools as those in population sparse areas. So they set a cutoff. I think it was 50 people per square mile, and if you were in an area that had a population density of less than 50 people per square mile, then the assumption was that consolidation would be difficult for that district, and they allowed those districts to receive the small school weight. In Vermont, they chose, we had school level data, so we could apply small school weights. Here we have district level data, so we're applying small district weights. But the idea could be the same. If you want to define what necessarily small is, then and apply the weight only to those districts, then I think that would be a policy option that you can consider.
So, Drew, if we took sort of Jay's question right now and turned that into a what if we wanted to what if we wanted to exclude the enrollment weighting from the estimated cost model? Would the base and other weights have to be recalibrated to get to the estimate, to try to model estimated costs? And then I guess how would that factor into I don't know what you call it, long-term error, maintenance error, something like that of estimated costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think if certainly the base would have to be adjusted, because you would not be allocating the dollars through the enrollment weight, so your number of weighted pupils would go down. And if your number of overall weighted pupils goes down, then the base has to go up to maintain the same amount of overall revenue distribution. So that's just kind of a mechanical issue. But then the other issue is whether district enrollments are correlated with any of the other variables that are included in our model. And if so, then the exclusion, if we went all the way back to the start and excluded enrollment from our model, then the other variables the other weights would change. For instance, I know several of you have talked about how the small districts might also be have the least FRL, the fewest FRL students as a percentage. So if that was the case, then the exclusion of the small districts might actually make the FRL weight stronger because, well, I won't speculate, but it might. I mean, the amount of variation from FRL, or the amount of variation from the enrollment weights, would then be sucked into FRL. So the variation in enrollment that's correlated with free and reduced price lunch would then be sucked into the free and reduced price lunch weight. Likewise, if special education is correlated with district size, some of the variation in enrollment might be sucked into the special ed weight. So, so yeah, I mean, it would be, yeah, the weights would definitely change if we went all the way to the back to the start and estimated a new cost model, leaving out enrollment weights. And I think enrollment is a cost that I don't think should necessarily be discarded. There are districts that are small and are necessarily small, and they have high costs. And I don't know if it would be reasonable to assume that those necessarily small districts could operate on the same amount of money as a district with 4,000 or 5,000 students.
Yeah, so Drew, along that same line then, you know, whether the enrollment size weighting, you know, creates some sort of incentive for a district to do something or something else. I suppose the other weights could incentivize a district to do something or something else as well. And the way you've got the way the two funding examples that you've got basically show 100% of the estimated costs being covered. But I guess, is there a tipping point as to where if the estimated costs were to change? And this is more of like in your professional judgment, your experience, that now a district in making those structural decisions, whether it's district size or tuition students or whatever it is, that a school district would be picking up part of the cost. Is there a tipping point where that becomes more of a factor, or at least an equal factor in school, I guess, management decisions?
I'm not entirely, I understand the question, but I think the problem is if the incentives are not in alignment with serving the kids. So in the case of enrollment, where there is a discontinuity between 600 and 601 students, and a district says we're not going to accept any more students because we don't want to go into the 601 category, that's not a good outcome for students. In the case of serving high poverty students, I don't think it's a bad outcome for districts to say we want to be able to serve the high poverty students in this state, and we're willing to accept more high poverty students and serve them well in order to gain a little bit more money. Another area where there is potential for kind kind of the perverse incentives as in special education. Special education is a little more wishy-washy, where there's not as clear of a guideline as to what makes a kid a special education student or not. So districts do have the ability to choose to identify more students as special education students, and that's probably not a good thing. So I think there are certainly incentives into here, but into these models, and there are incentives with any funding model, and you just have to, I think, address the incentives as best you can, potentially through some other policy decisions at the edges of the model. But I think the model as a whole is probably better than where things were to begin with.
Drew, while I know my question was clumsy, I think you got entirely the gist of it. So thank you very much. I thought I saw another hand up there, but I do see Rick's. I think Chris. Hang on, Rick. I think Chris may have been up before you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sort of following these arguments, I wonder if people who are uncomfortable with the small schools waiting, a small district waiting, would feel differently about it being small schools. I think and I understand what the data is at the level where we can't model it by school, but the original information that was based on Bruce's research, was that based on school size or district size?
The efficiency of districts there is research at the district level that looks at the efficiency of districts as their size varies.
Okay, thank you for that. I think some of the kinds of incentives that people are worried about are related to districts choosing to remain apart, as opposed to schools where we all understand that, particularly with elementary schools, the will of people not to consolidate, even when it's a very small school, depending on distance and location. Just an observation.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And then Rick had his hand up, and then we're going to do a quick time check, so where we are.
Thank you very much, Dave. Doing a check on some of the stuff you and I did 2 years back with equalized valuation per pupil. The 27 school districts, which are on the lowest side of equalized valuation per pupil, of those 27 districts, that's below $660,000 per pupil, one district is less than 200 kids. One district out of those 27. When I looked at the districts that have equalized valuations of $1 million or more per pupil, I counted just very quickly now 120 districts. Half of those districts have less than 200 kids. So, the whole concept we're looking at here that I initially was pushing, because I'm used to it in the state of Alaska, where we had significant issues with transportation. Teachers couldn't get them. Housing, we had to provide housing. Operation plants was very difficult when you had to fly all your fuel into the district where there were no roads. These are geographic aspects. In terms of instructional aspects, we couldn't get services for kids either. So we'd have to fly in a speech pathologist 100 miles each way just to get the speech therapy taken care of in the schools. So I see that being a real issue. But when I introduced legislation about 10 years ago on this small school issue, and I've mentioned it before here, one of our senators that is well known said, well, we are just going to start having small schools too, so we can tag in on this money. So I think it's a good concept, but I don't know if a small state like New Hampshire is ready for it.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Corinne?
Just wanted to add, I agree with Rick. I mean, just looking at the 24 towns that I looked at within the North Country region, exactly 12 of them have less than 200 kids. So that's a pretty large percentage just in a region. So you're right, Rick.
Yeah, and one of those schools is one of our wealthy towns. It's a donor town that I know of, just right next door to this one I'm in right now.
It is.
And yeah, I won't say it.
All right, were there any other questions on this point? Bill, I think I might have missed you when you had a hand up earlier.
No, I was, Drew actually anticipated. He came up with the Vermont example because a number of people have talked to me about concerns over the incentives in the model driving choices about size or other things. And Vermont recognized that. I would say, with respect to Corinne's comment, I'd be very concerned about not, when you think of the North Country, and Corinne, I did bringing the hospitals together up there because the consolidation was important, but you don't want to disadvantage, the distances are so large. So the Vermont solution that Drew referenced is a paradigm kind of example for how people could address this concern of, I won't call them perverse incentives, Jay, but just incentives in the model. So I think he answered it. I thought the Vermont example is right on point for the concerns of a number of folks who have asked me this question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. So let's sort of see where we're at right now, because I think a lot of the rest of this afternoon's meeting, we wanted to swing it over to Senator Khan and talk us through some planning on what may be coming up in terms of recommendations from the adequacy work group. But I wanted to make sure we wrap up this discussion where everybody feels like they've got their questions answered from Drew, and I think this is going to be taken up next Tuesday in adequacy. Bill.
I had one question, very technical. Drew, on the town simulator, there is the total cost, the program cost, the simulated program cost, which is in column V, 2.915 billion. And then when you're determining the additional local property tax that's necessary to get people to actual adequacy state property tax and local property tax, which is in column X, that column totals 2.972, a difference of like 56.8 million. And I was having trouble remembering, because I think you told me, what is the difference between those two numbers? So that you're determining the additional tax based on a bigger number than the simulated program number.
Yeah, so for each town, we're calculating the difference between those two values, X minus V. And then if the town, if X is greater than V, then we're assuming that the town might want to apply an additional tax to get up to that level. But we're only applying the additional tax if that column X is greater than V. So we're not saying towns would lower their tax rate if X is less than V. So we're only applying that additional tax if X is greater than V. And so we're using the property valuation to come up with the tax rate that would be necessary to raise the additional revenue to get back to column X if V is less than X.
I got it. I got those relationships. Why is the total in column X 56.8 million higher than the calculation of total simulated formula funding in column V? Why aren't they similar? What are the additional costs that are excluded in getting to the total simulated formula funding model? Is it like debt service, special ed? Why is there a difference?
Yeah, I think part of the difference is just that they're different sources of funding or sources of information. So to calculate column B, we just simply added up the actual revenue from the adequacy grant, the local property tax revenue, and the state property tax revenue. When we were calculating formula funding, we were calculating current spending. So current spending is not concerned about the source of the fund, but is concerned about what the dollars are used for. So the current spending does exclude the big capital projects on new construction or the debt service, and obviously the grant from local property tax and state revenue doesn't include federal dollars, but we also backed out the federal dollars from the calculation of the total funding. So I don't think the amount of difference is that extreme, and in the report we tried to make that point. I forget what figure it was, but we showed the total amount of projected funding compared to the total amount of revenue in that column B, and they're off by maybe 1%.
Yeah.
So it's not a huge difference.
Got it. Thanks for going through it. I thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question, Bill. All right. So we're coming on, we're running about 25 minutes behind schedule right now. And does everybody have what they need or what they want out of this conversation for now? I don't think we certainly didn't adjudicate anything, but we I think are now better informed as to what went into the new model, the enrollment weighting factor, and I think some of the considerations with respect to enrollment weight and if that were included or not included, what would that do to the rest of the model? So, Jay, is that something you're going to be able to work with?
Well, I think what it's pointing out to me is the value of having Drew in these conversations. We do drift into the low waters of the formula, and I think in order to see clearly, we do need his insights to help us answer some of these questions. Drew, thank you. But just to tee up, I think in the remainder of the commission's discussions, your value to help us sort through the what if, so that we're dealing with $57 million questions, which aren't insignificant in the long term. And understanding, I just point made, and I thank you for being present, and hope that we're able to call on you for our future commission meetings.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, and you can definitely call on me whenever you need me.
Great, thanks, Drew. Bruce, do we need Drew for the rest of this meeting or any parts coming forward?
Not for today, I don't think. I just sent him a note saying that he's done his duty for today. We're shifting into a policy discussion at this point. Welcome to stay, of course, but Drew's time is valuable as well. So on to democracy.
All right. Drew, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. We'll see you soon. Okay, for the second half of today's program, we wanted to really sort of talk about a high level policy matter, which has come up in the past court decisions, and I think we all know that it's the legislature's responsibility to define what an adequate education is and define what the cost for an opportunity of an adequate education is. And those are a couple of things that I think are spelled out in statute. And I want to turn it over to Jay to sort of lead us through the thinking here.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the adequacy work group that I think struggled with this, but worked through it well. In the revised agenda that Bruce sent us at 12:57, at least in my mailbox, there is a motion, and it really is the first two lines of that motion that I think is in front of us. And I think what the adequacy group, work group is calling to the attention of the commission is that we do need to, a very foundational question for us is, are we going to use outcomes that are already specified in the RSAs on adequate education? Will we use those criteria, those outcomes, as a basis for a distribution formula that the commission is wanting to recommend? We all know it leads to weights, and I appreciate Iris having considered what it is that we're actually trying to do, what we're saying. We, as a work group, tweaked this to the suggested paragraph that's here. The reason why not to finalize on this paragraph just today, one, you'll notice in the motion that there's, it talks about RSA 193E2. So the entirety of E2 and not necessarily just a specific paragraph or section within it. And why that might be significant is that first, there are a couple of sections to E2. And second, E1, as Bill had pointed out in a memo that he'd written, E1 is the policy and purpose section of the statute. And it is important before we get to an endpoint for the commission's recommendations that we consider the policy. It's like the introductory paragraph, the introductory chapter of a book or a dissertation. You wouldn't write it until you were finished with all of your conclusions. I think it's the same thing with the policy and purpose section. We need to come back and address that, but we should address that with greater insights into what the overall recommendations of the commission are. So I think this is the right first step. I think we've got a good sketch of how we would need to modify the E2B language. But I think what we need to do right now is consider this first sentence on the motion. And Bruce, thank you for summarizing this for us. I think this is what the intent of the committee is. And please, committee members, if I've misstated any of that, you'll point it out. But I think that's what I propose, and I would move that motion for our consideration.
All right, so Senator Khan's making a motion here. Is that seconded? And then we can open it up for some discussion. Seconded by Barbara Tremblay. So thoughts on this? Why are we doing this, Jay? You just said it, but.
Well, because it's just foundational to what we've got. We can't go forward with the work of AIR without having the concept that it is an outcomes-based, that we're trying to establish comparable outcomes of an adequate education, as opposed to measuring what the comparable inputs are of every district. To no fault of previous analyses, they are founded on having set formulas for elementary, middle, and high schools, class sizes, administrative costs, and a whole variety of inputs that are, really based on assumptions that we have not evolved in this commission study. We very early on determined that the outcomes of an adequate education are what we wanted to investigate. What are the true weights that districts bear for students that have particular needs and districts that have particular characteristics? We have that model in front of us. And I think that, it's a matter of us getting comfortable with some of the weights, but I don't think that we're uncomfortable with the fact that we're trying to standardize the outcomes for every student, every child in our public schools. And that's what we have before us in our simulators, in our recommendations from AIR. I think it's time to embrace this model so that we can go forward in the next few weeks trying to work with it and the other recommendations that need to come with it, many of which will come from fiscal policy and the other recommendations that the adequacy group needs to come up with, because this model doesn't incorporate everything. There's still going to be categorical aid. There's still going to need to be additional measures that need to be collected by the state in order to refine education funding for districts. But this, as we know, this is going to recommend no less money for public education, but it does recommend a means for distributing it that is outcome-based, and that's what the motion says.
So Jay, just to be clear though, we've got a lot of data on this over the last 9 months, but we know that the cost to obtain an outcome, a certain performance level in one district, in District A, District B might be able to do that for $5,000 less, and the AIR report indicates that, and the estimated cost models indicate that too. So what are we suggesting as far as the costs for what's the word here? The cost for comparable educational outcome for all students.
Yeah, and thanks for teeing up the question, because I think we recognize that the answer to that is it's going to vary by student, and that what it costs a district is dependent on what those student needs are. So we've got a model that plays that through, and yes, I think this is the refinement that we were looking for. It's not an input-based formula based on just a number of students. These students have varying needs, and we know that of our students, and some will more easily achieve the state, and some districts will be can achieve those outcome standards easier than other districts because of their student makeup. And this is recognizing that for those needy districts that need to raise more money per child in order to achieve that.
Great, thanks Jay. Iris, you've got a hand up? Oh, you're muted, Iris.
Good point. I want to make sure I understand the motion. The motion that we got in the late agenda, is it to amend RSA 193E2 to reflect a public education funding distribution formula that creates the opportunity to obtain comparable educational outcomes for all students? Is that the entire motion? Okay.
That's my understanding.
Sorry, now I lost my sound for a minute, so I didn't hear the answer.
I didn't. I had it off.
Oh, is that the motion?
It is.
Okay, because I see that as a different statement than what is contained in the suggested wording of E2 that we worked on in committee.
Mhm.
I think the wording of that we've suggested for the statute, and I'm not saying I support it, but I think what it says is that the costs of reaching a targeted outcome equals the opportunity for an adequate education. Whereas the statement in your motion, to me, the formula that was passed just speaks only to the distribution formula. It doesn't speak to the cost. And I could argue that the distribution formula in the 07, even though it was input based, it was weighted in a way that did try to create the opportunity for comparable educational outcomes. So to me, the motion's much broader and easier to embrace, therefore, than the language actually suggested here.
Let's let Jay, you want to respond to that? And then I've got hands up from Corrine and Bill, so.
Sure. I don't object to what the work group is proposing here, with the one exception that I think that one of the differences between the two is that in the work group's longer motion, it says 193E2A, and I'd just like it to, we need to take off the A because E2 in its entirety, there are a couple of sections there, and it's the entirety of E2 that really is the adequate education definition. And if the rest of the commission would like to go forward with the wording, I'm fine with approving going forward with that. I think we refined it pretty well.
So Jay,
yeah,
when you look at the wording on that though, is it you've got public education funding distribution formula? Is it a funding distribution or is it a cost distribution?
Well, that was my point, that the motion itself only spoke to the distribution formula, whereas the language of the suggested E2A, take out the A, speaks to the idea of the costs being equal to that, reaching those targeted incomes, which is a much more specific thing to endorse. And I'm suggesting that we go there. I like the broader motion better, but I'm just saying there's a difference.
Jay, did you want to? I got hands up too, but did you want to?
Let's hear from others.
All right.
I think we've got two ways of going here, but I think what Iris is saying is accurate. What ultimately we are recommending is an estimated cost model, and that is true. We will be as a final outcome presenting an estimated cost model.
All right, let's take some hands here. I've got Corrine, then Bill, then Chris.
Okay, just a little bit more. This is great. I feel like we're really moving forward by seeing some language that's starting to move changes. Will this meet the constitutional requirement for adequacy? That's my first question. My second one was, is this commission to decide exactly what the variables are in that cost model if we accept that, or are we expecting the legislators to be able to determine whether there's transportation or not transportation? Are we recommending a package to the legislators? Just so I'm just trying to look ahead as to, you know, what road we're headed down as we start to tackle the components of what we're established to do, you know, which is adequacy, improving the taxpayers, dealing with the equity of tax payments, and then the quality of education for everyone. So maybe it's another conversation just to know what are the parts and pieces that we are responsible for, and what are we bringing forth, and how much detail does that have? So I was very happy to see some amendment already. It's great.
Jay, you want to tackle that quickly?
Yeah, so just in the detail and then work to the constitutional question where I think others will have insights as well. But on the detail of, are there other recommendations that would need to come forward from the adequacy work group? Absolutely. And we began to tee those up in our last conversation. And in particular, you mentioned transportation. And I think we have a recommendation there. We talked it through, but we'll do that at the next meeting. I think we know where we're going to head with that, and that the amount of information that we have to make that categorical is insufficient to have a different distribution than what AIR has included in its model. So I think that's where that's going to head. But we'll have that recommendation will be for a subsequent meeting. Relative to the constitutional question of an opportunity for an education, the courts have asked that the legislature define adequacy. We are not changing the definition of adequacy. We are changing a distribution formula. So whether we call this a distribution formula or the final recommendation for an education cost model, I think is a matter of specificity, as Iris said.
Great, thanks, Jay. I've got Bill and Chris.
Thank you. First, I am so sorry to my fellow colleagues on the adequacy work group that I had an emergency come up and I missed our meeting. I'm sorry about that. So this is my first comment. I think that the issue that Iris identified, which is a more general concept versus specific language, is important. The language that I'm reading that would be statutory language, I see as having a couple of detailed problems in it, and including that it's a little bit of mixing, as I read it, the effort to define adequacy with parts that are part of the effort, the secondary effort and distinct effort, which is to determine the value or cost of adequacy. To me, those are two separate things. In the definition of adequacy, I believe the revolutionary step that we as a commission have been reviewing is to define adequacy not in terms of a set of inputs that are listed in current law. It's listed in 193E2A, substantive content of it. That's what it's called, substantive educational content for an adequate education. The shift that we're proposing, in fact, I believe would put that to the side and say the way that the legislature or this commission is recommending, but ultimately the legislature is considering defining adequacy, is in terms of a targeted outcome, which in the AIR simulation model is average outcomes across the state, that every child in every district should be able to reach that average outcome. When you look at, and remember, that doesn't say anything about the cost, which Jay, getting to the cost or value of what that adequacy definition means for each district, that's a process of the step one AIR, which is the education cost model, and the step 2 AIR, which is assigning weights to various characteristics so that you get to those differential costs. That adequacy, by the way, the cost of adequacy, the value of adequacy under AIR model is different for every district. It is different. That's revolutionary. So when I look at the motion says, hey, commission members, and this is just the first sentence that Iris focused on, are we gonna support as a group moving from the current model and the one that has been applied for the last 25 years that says the substantive content of what an education is the definition of adequacy. Remember, we're not costing it yet, to a different definition, which says we're going to define adequacy in terms of what the outcome should be across the whole state. That's so fundamental, Jay, that I think it deserves a vote without getting into the weeds of the language of a motion, of an actual statutory language, because I have a lot of, I think there are little issues with that language, and it was my fault that I missed our meeting. I admit that, and I take responsibility for it. But that I think it would be best to start with just the concept motion. Do we as a commission support leaving the input cost, the input concept of definition of adequacy to one side and substituting the outcome definition of adequacy, that concept? That's a big vote. And I, for one, would vote yes, because I think it has been a failure that we haven't set a clear standard that says kids in Claremont, under our definition, are supposed to achieve an outcome, rather than kids in Claremont are supposed to have this library type, this teacher-student ratio, this, that all that stuff is important, but it doesn't resonate as clearly to me as what we're trying to get them to is a performance that is good as the average performance of a very high quality New Hampshire public school system on average. So my question to you, Jay, is with that background, I would like to suggest that we focus on the concept motion and leave the language to the side and have a separate vote on that.
I think it's just the one sentence motion. It's not the language that's down below that in the.
Is that the case?
Yes.
Okay. Then
Yeah.
I for the reasons I said, I think it's a fantastic recommendation for this commission to move in this direction.
So the other thing, and just to sort of challenge the theory a little bit, Bill, it was the substantive educational content, the current language in E2A that got us to the statewide average outcomes we have today. I mean, that's a starting point. The outcomes are an ending point. So,
Well, let me try.
Why does that need to change? Why couldn't we leave? And this maybe we're jumping into a discussion we don't need to have today. I'm sure we are. Why can't we leave the definition of adequacy alone, the substantive educational content, and all that stuff, and just change the costing of adequacy to reflect the estimated cost model that is determined based on outcomes and based on characteristics of students and districts?
Let me try a hypo. I believe the court has said, among other things, number one, the legislature has to define adequacy. Number two, the legislature has to determine the value or cost of adequacy. So those are two separate things that have come out several times. There are others. Imagine that you define adequacy, Dave, as these minimum standards that are listed in the current law. And then you say value or determine the cost by virtue of a reference to an outcome goal. Someone could argue that that has a disconnect built into it. They could say to the court, to a court, for example, you know, they defined adequacy in terms of inputs and minimum standards, but their costing methodology doesn't look to those standards to determine, for example, the cost of what it costs to have a social studies, English, math, science, to have these standards. You know, those are really input concepts, Dave, as I look at them. And so I'm worried that there's a disconnect. We really have to say, I believe, that adequacy is defined as a targeted outcome goal. And then in the valuation part, to determine the value or cost of adequacy, you apply the ECM model, which is absolutely connected to that definition of adequacy. The ECM model is at its core based on what is the predicted cost necessary to get to that defined target of adequacy. Remember, you know, Drew's model or the AIR model allows you to change what the standard is. Is it state average? Is it 50th percentile, 55th percentile? Is it 40th percentile? The definition of adequacy is that target, that standard. And then the cost system is directly tied to proving it. So you would avoid the possible argument that the legislature defined adequacy in terms of inputs with standards, minimum standards, and then their cost method has nothing to do with inputs. And therefore, on its face, it violates the concept of defining adequacy and determining the cost. That would be my.
I don't think that. So I'll disagree with you, Bill, and I think we'll continue on this path. But I don't think that the goals of an adequate education that are in statute are input driven. I think that that people acquire, and I think Rick, you want to make sure that we said knowledge and skills, and so maybe there's some tweaking of E2, but it is the knowledge and skills that one is to have as an outcome. We aren't changing that. We continue to assess those the schools and the students for that they're achieving comparable outcomes in these areas. So I don't think that, I think actually there is a value for us to take the existing statutes and define for anybody observing our work how our work is complementary of the existing statutes. And I think that can be done without a pretzel twist trying to fit it in. I think we've used outcomes that are already defined in 193. I think we're using standards that are already defined in statute. And as I think we will also agree, we are developing a cost estimation model that is based on achieving those comparable outcomes. So I think, you know, anyway, I just don't want us to in the change say that we have abandoned current statute, because I don't think we've done that.
No, understood. I understand your point.
No, thanks, Jay. I've got Chris, then Dick, then Iris.
Yes, 4 points related to language. I think it's important to, and as I think where Iris was going, to pair cost determination and funding distribution. I don't think we want one without the other because of, you know, the concepts that we're trying to get across here. That's one point. Second, I think, and this occurs not in the motion, but in the other language, we need to be careful to use the word comparable, not as a modifier of opportunity, but as a modifier of outcome to, again, underline this point. I think 3, when we talk about student outcomes, we should we should pair it with student outcomes in terms of performance. And then for this notion of by student, I think it's the all students in each district phrase that's important. So it isn't, it underlines the variation in both costing and distribution by district. So some of that language is in the motion, some of it is in the longer piece there, but I think those are four concepts that, you know, we've talked about, at least the first one a lot, but I think the other three are important as well for clarity.
Great, Chris, thanks. Dick? Oh, you're muted, Dick.
I said fantastic things, but you missed them. So I'm going to be short. I agree with Jay's response to Bill's suggestion that we move away from the pairing that I think we should be moving towards of the new outcomes concept that we've developed with the existing standards and specifics around goals that we have in the statute. I don't think it's one or the other. I think we need both. And I wouldn't want any motion to suggest that we're going down a pathway that leaves sort of hanging what the specific content that we expect of to be a part of an adequate education. We want to measure outcomes and to determine cost based on outcomes, and I think that's we've really gained a lot of ground there, and I look forward to bringing that to a closure. But let's not leave behind the importance of minimum standards, and then I do have a problem with the motion that's before us, and it's the motion is to amend the RSA to reflect a distribution formula. I'm shortening it. That creates the opportunity to attain comparable education outcomes for all students. And that's a shortened version of the draft statutory language, but it's left out something that's rather significant. There's no reference to an adequate education. So comparable to what? There's got to be a frame of reference. There's got to be a standard. It's not there, and there is that in the draft statute. We'd be embracing an outcomes-based cost model to identify the costs necessary for all students to have a comparable opportunity for an adequate education. So with those words, it brings into sight and into this specific reference to how we're going to cost things, the concept of an adequate education, which I believe still needs to be treated as it has been treated in the rest of the statute. So those are my comments.
Dick, to be clear, I'm sorry, David, you probably
yeah, I'm going to do the same thing. Go ahead, Jay.
Well, so you're wanting to add those 4 words, the opportunity for an adequate education to attain comparable educational outcomes.
Yes, that's well done, Jay.
Yeah, and also, Dick, I thought you suggested rather than using a funding distribution formula, you talked about a cost model based on outcomes.
That's good. Yeah, I like that too. You guys are great.
Well, we're just listening to you, Dick.
Yes.
Yeah, I've got Iris, then Mel.
Well, I mean, if you make those changes, my comment is irrelevant. I found the wording as it existed, as I said before, was broad enough to include all kinds of approaches. I think we're talking in circles here. We did an input-based costing methodology in order to provide the opportunity for equal educational outcomes. I mean, it's a circular thing you're talking about, whether the inputs lead to the outputs. I mean, here we're doing outputs in order to lead to a cost for inputs. I mean, we're not ignoring inputs here. These variable costs from district to district are the cost of the inputs. So, I think the idea that this is revolutionary is a little far. It's turning things around. And the question is, does that result in a fairer distribution? And I'm not sure. But I think that the changes you're proposing based on David's comments, which are Dick's comments, I mean, are important comments, substantially change the motion. And I'd need some time to absorb what that new meaning is, frankly.
Okay, Mel?
Well, my concern is this, is that my basic goal, I think I kind of agree with Bill on this, is that I think the commission needs to make a single commitment on the issue of outcome-based funding, period. And I think from there, once that is made, then all the other conversations we've been having fall in line. It gives you a framework to basically make those later decisions. And it seems to me that in today's time, we have a lot more data that talks about outcomes. 10 years ago, we didn't have that. We now have all kinds of testing that kids are going through as one measurement of outcomes. We didn't have that 10 years ago. And so for me, a commitment on the part of the commission to say, we need to move to this outcome-based and to look at how that's going to impact kids across the state. That for me is foundation. That's the threshold question for me, because everything else flows from that. And so that's really what I'm looking for from the commission, to see where we are as a commission around the issue of moving from an input base to an outcome base. And I do believe, not to disagree with Iris, but I do think it is a fundamental change in looking how we provide funding for students across the state.
So Mel, I mean, I think we are saying a lot of the same things, but just saying them a little bit differently. What Iris said makes absolute sense. I mean, you don't buy the outcomes, you buy the inputs that lead to outcomes, and we know that that in some districts we're going to need a greater set of inputs to get to a certain outcome, and whether that's how districts go about doing that is a different thing. But I think what is revolutionary is that we're estimating the cost of an adequate education or an opportunity for an adequate education based on every student having an opportunity to receive the same educational outcome, whether you go to school in Manchester or you go to school in Bow, or you go to school in Claremont or Berlin. And in order to get those comparable outcomes, districts are going to, what Manchester's going to do is going to have to be different than what Bow does, and it's different than what Berlin does, and it's different than what Claremont does. And I think we've got a terrific estimated cost model that factors in what those differences would need to be in order to provide every student with an opportunity for these comparable outcomes. So I think from the the first question that was asked by Corrine in this segment was are we meeting, what are we doing to meet the constitutional requirements? Jay laid it out really well. The Constitution, the court says it's up to the legislature. It's got to do two things. It's got to define it and it's got to cost it. And as far as what I can tell, it's not the defining it that AIR has said that New Hampshire hasn't done a good basis, because overall, whatever we're defining and whatever we're getting on a statewide basis is pretty darn good. It's some of the best in the country. It's among the best in New England, among the best in the country. But we haven't been doing a good job at costing it, and that's what AIR showed us. And so I think the words that we've suggested, that Dick talked about, that Jay talked about, are really sort of getting to what is it that we're trying to do. I don't know if we're trying to. I don't think we're trying to redefine what goes into an adequate education. In fact, AIR said that's entirely up to us. They're not helping us with that. I mean, I think they said that right at the beginning. But they are going to help us with costing out what would go into an adequate education.
Dave, excuse me, but I've tried to capture what I've heard as amendments to the motion. I can put those on the screen if you want to do a little bit of wordsmithing. Given the time of day, we may just want to at least have this as a placeholder, probably put this on the table, massage it a little bit more, bring it back, and then possibly get to public comment today. But if you'd like, I can at least show what I think I've heard so far that captures this.
Jay?
Yeah, Bruce, give me 1 second on that.
Yeah.
This will be brief. The point of the change is that in E2B of statute, which is a section titled Cost of an Adequate Education, it says the court shall make an initial determination of the necessary specific resource elements to be included in the opportunity for an adequate education. I think it's that specific resource elements, 3 words, that drives this notion of the input-based model. It's essentially those 3 words that we're trying to move away from and towards a more outcome-driven distribution of resources. And I hope that the motion is capturing that change. Bruce, maybe you should know how far we've progressed as a
Yeah, let's see what this looks like.
So changed it to, a costing formula and not a distribution formula. And then that creates an opportunity for an adequate education needed to attain comparable educational outcomes. So I a few words, but trying to capture the key conceptual elements in this discussion we've just had.
Let's just sort of go, Jay, what do you think? And then sort of Dick and Bill.
I think this captures what we were saying as far as wording changes.
Dick, you'd suggested some language.
Likewise, I think it looks good to me.
Okay, and then how about Bill and Iris?
I think if I'll go first, I think it does reflect the feeling that I had and tried to express. I want to make clear, I am not suggesting that the statute should eliminate any minimum standards. I did not, the statute has tons of regulatory requirements for public schools. They should all stay. I'm saying my focus was not to delete minimum standards, but to focus on the shift from, determining the value of an adequate education in terms of outcomes versus cost. To Iris, I lead into Iris, the 2008 legislative study said that the committee determined the universal cost of an adequate education to be $3,456 per pupil. The universal cost amount includes amounts for teacher salary and benefits, principal and principal assistant salaries, and on and on and on and on technology. It's important to note that the cost numbers that the AIR report is generating are generated from an education cost model that does not focus on those particular inputs. Yes, the money goes into a district and then is used to, as the district determines, pay for all the costs that they have locally. But in terms of determining the cost or value of an adequate education, I believe this is more like Mel said, this is revolutionary change. And so, yes, I support this language.
Great. Iris, you had some thoughts.
I still think it's broad enough to include just about anything. I mean, I would argue that the input-based model was intended to attain comparable educational outcomes. It still doesn't specifically say that the costing formula is based on this targeted average outcome. I'm not sure. I think it needs a little more words, I think, to say what you want it to say. As it stands here, to me, it's saying, like, of course I support the opportunity for an adequate education. It's not specific enough, I don't think, but we'll see.
Okay, anybody else? Because I can't really see hands right now. Anybody else have anything to add? Mel?
I'm good.
All right, so do we want to take like just sort of like a straw poll on, or Corinne, was that a hand up?
Yeah. Just a quick comment. Questioning if there's a difference between the word comparable and equitable, because we're always talking about equitable outcomes, and we're talking about equality, equal opportunities. Do people think that the word comparable means the same?
No, I think it's different. But I think comparable means more like equal as opposed to equitable.
Okay.
And I think this was, I think the AIR simulator was actually derived based on equal outcomes, not equitable outcomes.
Okay.
And if
so it fits.
Can I put a little explanation or some comment to Iris's point about targeted educational outcomes, because we discussed this in the committee. I think the feeling that was expressed, and Iris, I think you did that, to attain targeted educational outcomes for all students. And I think that wording is carried through in the more specific language that there is for the amendment. But I think that was one point that we had recommended in the wording. And so I just wanted to tee that up for others. I think a way to accommodate Iris's comment there is that targeted would achieve if it's replaces the word comparable.
And what you really want people to embrace is targeted average educational outcomes.
Thank you.
If you're really embracing this specific model, that's what it is.
We could say statewide and avoid the, nobody wants to be average.
I mean, you could just, I think you just use targeted outcomes. Yeah. You know. Maybe we come up with a better word than targeted too.
Well,
so.
and
That's much more specific about what kind of a model you're talking about.
Bill?
I would be hesitant to specify, it looks like you're just talking about the concept here of outcomes instead of input. I think that's very relevant. In terms of any details of the model, like choosing statewide average as the beginning point, I think that remains to be tied down with a lot of details, including ones that Iris has mentioned on weightings and things like that.
I agree.
So what do we need here? What do we need here, Bruce? Do we need a formal vote on this, or is it
Yeah, I think we do.
consensus of the commission? What do we need?
Boy, that's up to you. You're the chair, but
Well, I mean, this doesn't change any language. It's not proposing any term.
no.
But I think if we want to call it a commission finding, then I think we should either vote on it now or straw poll it now, and then as we're going through the slate of findings, take votes on them. So I could see doing it anyway, but I think we're going to have to vote on it sooner or later.
I think a straw poll would express the preferences of the commission around this shift to this conceptual shift to outcomes-based education that then drives costing.
Does that work for you, Jay?
Yeah, it does work. I think, we're developing the findings or principles on which this is based. That was the whole purpose of this, is to not arrive necessarily at our final findings, but to establish a principle on which we can continue to make progress with other motions that need to come forward that are going to be more specific. I think at this point, rather than if this is going to get voted, I think the comparable, it probably is, and whether Corinne's equitable word, I don't know, but I think targeted carries some weight and some burden in educational policies in the past that maybe targeting has some unintended notions for people that we should not take on at this moment.
I agree.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want this to be interpreted that we would target, let's say, Bow to have higher outcomes for all their students than Manchester, that we target Manchester at a lower outcome. I wouldn't want it to be read that way.
Bruce, can you help us out?
Yeah, I think our intent here is, again, to set a threshold concept. The specifics of that is going to come about as recommendations from the work group, et cetera. So I think this is fine to get that threshold concept.
Yeah. Mel, I agree with you. And Bruce, I think you just improved, we're back to what you had, and I think that's good.
Yeah.
Everybody all right to just do this as a straw poll, just so that the J and adequacy can move on? Yeah. And then we can move into public comment. So if everybody generally agrees with this, just a show of hands, I think we'll do it.
Can you see everybody?
I see. Jay, do you have your hand up? Are you generally in agreement?
Can we take it down? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure everybody could see it. So, so I think I'm getting everybody except I don't see Iris and Rick. So, but I think it's a general consensus that that the commission agrees with to move forward with this. All right. Anything else we got to do on this segment? Because if not, I'm getting a little speaker feedback. Yep, thanks, Dick. Are we ready to go into a little bit of public comment, Bruce?
Yeah, just to mention at the bottom of the agenda, we'd raised a couple of questions about scheduling to put before the group. Our next full commission meeting, let's see, is the 19th. 2 weeks after that, and that was an extended meeting that we've already decided to give us more time for deliberation, given where we're headed now based on today's discussion. November 2nd then is the next scheduled meeting. That comes the day before the election. There was some notion within the executive team that people may be distracted that afternoon, and we would want to move that to Thursday of that week, our full commission meeting. And then along with that, given where we're headed right now and the amount of deliberation we need, to add another commission meeting on Monday, October 26th, and bump work group meetings till later in the week of October 26th. So that's on your agenda. A couple of scheduling questions, just maybe general sense of the group real quickly.
So thoughts on that? We could probably send that out as an email too, and just have people respond on that. Why don't we do that? This has been sort of a long meeting, so getting everybody to check
We'll
out.
do that, and then we'll just collect responses.
Yeah. All right. Cool. A couple things we've got. Let's see. We're going to open up the floor to general comments in a minute. Next, or this Wednesday, we're going to have a dedicated student voice comment period from 4 to 5, and then I think the Wednesday after that we'll be back open for general extended public comment. So with that, I'll open up the floor to members of our community that have stuck with us for the last 2 hours, 10 minutes. And let us know what they think, because that's important. Who are we seeing, Jordan?
Not seeing any hands yet. Folks in attendance, you can use the hand raise function if you're on a computer or tablet or in the Zoom app, or if you're on the phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand if you'd like to provide comment at this time.
Great, thanks, Jordan. So as always, you can always email your comments to let's see, schoolfunding.commission@unh.edu. You can also go to the commission website and leave your comments. If you scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, I think there's a submit comments section. So those all get collected and distributed to members of the commission. And I believe, are they also posted somewhere on the commission website now too?
That's correct. They are posted on the resources page. There is a tab. It's the second tab from the top, and it's got all the public comment. And you can find any specific public comments made in any of the sessions, the dedicated sessions, on the day of the session on the specific meeting page on the site.
Great. And that would include letters received and stuff like that that are also included as comments. So
that's correct. Yes. Terrific. There is a lot.
Terrific. Thanks, Jordan. All right. I'm not seeing anybody, but it's been a busy afternoon, and I think we've had a lot of good discussion. And if there's anything, members of the commission, any questions that come to your mind, 5 minutes after we get off the Zoom or middle of the night tonight on what we heard from Drew on the estimated cost model, put it together, email it to me or Bruce, and we can try to get that fielded between now and then, or as soon as possible. And like Bruce has said, Drew and Jesse's time is sort of on a metered basis at this point. So we can try to, if you've got questions, we'll batch them together and get them off to them. So anyway, anybody else, anything for the good of the cause? Jay, Mel? No? Bruce? Jordan, Carrie? All right. Well, I think everyone's talked out for this afternoon. Everyone be well, and I know everyone's staying busy, busier than ever. And we'll see you. Hopefully, we'll see you back here Wednesday, 4 o'clock for Student Voice. Oh, and just a plug: it should be an excellent session. We heard a little bit of preview on it last week, I think, and so I'm really looking forward to it. So, all righty.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.